Welcome to this Killick Explains video. This time, a word that's been around for decades, retirement, and me explaining why we need to retire it. So the background to this is what? Well, basically, previous generations have enjoyed several tailwinds that unfortunately younger generations, the generations that are following them, will not. In fact, some of these have actually become problems rather than solutions, and that has consequences for the way we think about the word retirement and the whole concept of retirement at a fixed date with a carriage clock from the company you work for or wherever it happens to be. That is something we need to rethink. Now, what have previous generations enjoyed then, the baby boomers, if you want to call it that other generations below them, following them, will not? Well, essentially, sustained rises in house prices. Now you might say, well, house prices have sort of carried on rising recently, haven't they? Yes, but the problem is if you're not on the ladder, getting onto it has never been more difficult. And I don't think anyone would now disagree with that statement. It was never easy, but it's never been this difficult as, say, a first-time buyer. Final salary pensions are becoming a thing of the past. First of all, even the people that offer them are trying to make them cheaper by moving it from final salary to average salary. That's a better deal for the employer, if you like, than the employee. And frankly, if you join a company and get offered one, it's a minor miracle these days. Yes, state employees still enjoy them, but the terms are being whittled away. And a generous welfare state. Basically, post the Second World War, the welfare state went through a huge phase of expansion, and everybody knows that things like the NHS are probably unsustainable in terms of more of us wanting access to more stuff more regularly. And so that has implications for the way that we view benefits going forward. Now, things are very different now. So just to summarise why, in case you hadn't picked that up from my previous comments, houses are out of reach for many young people these days without the help of bank of mum and dad, as it's called, or other sources of support. Defined benefit schemes are being phased out or made less generous. And the government is going to be forced, I'd imagine, post-coronavirus, to take a long, hard look at things like tax rises, at things like the benefit system. So it's highly unlikely, I think we can certainly say that without speculating, that the welfare state is going to expand any further, quite the reverse. Now, demographics. Here's another headwind, if you like. Not our friend, I've called it. What do I mean by that? Well, essentially, 17% of people are aged over 65 now, okay, according to the data source I looked at. By 2065, this will be 24%. So what that implies is you're going to have more older people potentially looking to be in retirement, drawing on something, whether it's benefits from the state, their own private pot, whatever it happens to be. All right, 2% of people are aged over 85 now. By 2065, and these are projections, that will be triple. It may not look like a big number, but it is 3 times. And in numeric terms, that's a big increase. And state support for pensioners is around 8.5% of GDP now, but could reach, depending on what Rishi Sunak does next, I guess, 12.5% based on those demographic numbers by 2065. So it's more people needing and wanting support, potentially financial and otherwise, but with less capacity to build it and draw on it, let's say. So who's going to pay for our retirement? And should we even be thinking about conventional retirement anymore? All right, so the average pension savings for people aged 45 to 54, now you can pick these data points up from different sources for different demographics, is around 71,000 according to LV. All right, now let's say you want a £25,000 income age 65 in retirement. I've made a whole raft of assumptions here which you have to do if you're planning to hand over a pot of money to get that kind of income. So bear with me on that. I don't want to go through those in detail right here. But the answer, and some people will say, well, it depends on the assumptions you make. Yes, it very much does. But the answer on a set of simple assumptions would be more like 500,000. So there's your gap. You need something like that. You can quibble on the exact size of the number, but one thing you can't quibble about is it's a lot bigger than that. And you might think, well, they've got a bit of time to crack on. But actually, in that age group, what time or what age would you be thinking conventionally about retiring? Well, I'd suggest it's not going to be the 55 or 60 or 65 even standard of previous years. People may have to think hard about whether they can afford to retire in a conventional sense. Now, for young people, Therefore, people who've got a bit more runway ahead of them, what does this mean? Well, I'm afraid what I'm about to say isn't exactly party news, but it is common sense. So we need to all be saving harder for longer, but young people do have time on their side. Start as early as possible. Seems dull to put money aside for retirement, but if you've got an employer who's chipping in, it's not just all falling on your shoulders. Getting cracking early can really make a big difference, with or without some family help, which I'll come back to, and harness the power of long-term compounding as best you can. So get started early, start building money on money, that's compounding, and call on as much help as possible. Simple to say, harder to execute in practice, but well worth thinking about. Now, every decade counts. So just to make the point here, using some simple facts, a bit of a wall of information, but if you were 25 now with a salary of £30,000, that's an assumption, a little bit above the current national average, let's say, your pension saving is 8% of income, all right, rising at 2% per annum. Now, you might think that sounds like a lot, but if you're working for a firm, an employer might be chipping in too. May not just be you that's got to come up with the money. Annual real growth assumed of 5%, assumed, not guaranteed. Based on history, stock market investing, not a promise, your pension pot age 65 will be around £400,000, building in some fairly key assumptions. If you took out a quarter tax-free, which you're entitled to do, pay down a mortgage, for example, give some help to children, grandchildren, for argument's sake, your expected income with the rest would be around £16,500, or about the minimum amount the government think we should all have in retirement, as it's conventionally known. Now, what's my point? You can think about whether that number's enough in a moment. Move the goalposts. If you're aged 30 now, same facts, okay? So pot aged 65 would then be £206,000 using these criteria. You take out a quarter of it tax-free. Your expected income would just be £8,500 on that set of assumptions. Your conclusions, your income has dropped substantially, and every decade therefore counts. So every single year that you're not making that contribution that can compound, essentially, you are potentially losing out. If anyone would like to understand the underlying assumptions, I can deal with those separately. So how can a family help? And I'll finish on this slide. So how could anxious parents or grandparents give a little bit of a boost up front, if you like, to generations to come? Well, one way would be a one-off contribution of £3,600. The government chip in a chunk of that, by the way, into a junior self-invested personal pension. Do that at birth, leave it alone. If it were to compound, ignoring charges at a real rate of 5% per annum, that is an assumption, then they may have a real pot, that's a purchasing power pot, if you like, of £110,000 when they turn 70. You might be thinking two things. Is that a lot? It's a pretty sizable contribution, gets them well on the way. And why 70? Well, I don't think realistically many of us are going to be retiring as young as was once the case. Any questions? editor@killick.com. And if you'd like to watch videos on other aspects of pensions, then it's killick.com/learn and the tax effective savings tab.